still use the pick. You use one half, I'll use the other. There's still some juice in there probably, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where's that thing? Ah!
One chance to rock your socks off.
Fuck! The demon code prevents me from declining a rock-off challenge. What are your terms? What's the catch?
If we win, you must take your sorry ass back to hell. And also you will have to pay our rent.
And what if I win?
Then you can take Cage back to hell.
What? Trust me, Cage. It's the only way. What are you talking about?
To be your little bitch.
Fine! Let the rock-off begin!
Come on, Cage! Let's fight his music with our music.
There's just no way that we can win. That was a masterpiece.
Listen to me.
He rocks too hard because he's not a mortal man.
God damn it, Cage! He gonna make you his sex slave. You're gonna gargle mayonnaise.
No.
Unless we bust a massive monster mamma jam.
Dude, we've been through so much shit.
Deactivated lasers with my dick. Now it's time to blow this fucker down.
Come on, Cage, now it's time to blow doors down.
I hear your jibbles, now it's time to blow doors down. Light up the stage, cause it's time for a showdown.
We'll bend you over, then we'll take it to Brown Town.
Now we got to blow this fucker down.
He's gonna rape me if we do not blow doors down.
Come on, Cage, cause it's time to blow doors down. We'll bomb drive you, it's time for the fight. Hey, the great star, Beelzebub. We know your weakness, a rocket sub. We rock the Casbah and blow your mind. We will defeat you for all mankind. You hold the scepter, we hold the key. You are the devil, we are the D. We are the D, 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 we are the D.
You guys are fucking lame! Come on, Cage, you're coming with me! Taste my lightning, fucker! Ow! Fuck! My fucking horn! Oh no!
From whence you came, you shall remain until you are complete again.
Fuck you, Cage! Tenacious D.